There is a time coming that is spoken of in the Bible in no uncertain terms. It is a time that is going to be so bad that unless it is cut short, then all of mankind would literally be wiped out. This time is referred to in many different ways. Matthew 24 calls this the time of the great tribulation. Joel 2 calls it the great and terrible day of the Lord. Daniel 12 talks about it in terms of being a time of trouble such as never was. Jeremiah 30 calls it the day of Jacob's trouble and says, who can be saved out of it? Because the day is so great that there is none like it. And then, of course, Revelation 3 talks about it in terms of being this hour of trial, a short period, relatively speaking, in terms of the world as a whole, but nonetheless, it's going to be long enough for God to get his point across. Now, while this is all going on, what is it that God has in store for his favored people? His church, his people, his Christians of that time that is yet in the near future. Let's turn over to Ezekiel 5. Ezekiel 5 is another place that talks about what is going to happen in the end time. And just briefly go over this and show how this is going to be devastating on all of mankind, and yet there is still hope for his people. Ezekiel 5, and we'll begin verses 1 and 2. Ezekiel 5, verses 1 and 2. Ezekiel 5, verse 1. And you, son of man, take a sharp sword, take it as a barber's razor, and pass it over your head and your beard, and take scales to weigh and divide the hair. So he's supposed to be very conscientious about taking the hair off of him. This is Ezekiel. And he's going to weigh it out exactly. He says, you shall then burn with fire 1/3 in the midst of the city when the days of the siege are finished. Then you shall take 1/3 and strike it around with the sword, and 1/3 you shall scatter in the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. And then continuing down verse 7, we see why a lot of this is coming upon the people in the end time. Therefore, the Lord God says, because you have multiplied disobedience more than the nations that are all around you, and Israel was supposed to be an example to everyone. God showed them favor. God gave them his law. He showed them the way to be, and they were supposed to be this example to everyone else on how to live. But they did not do that. You, going on, have not walked in my statutes, nor kept my judgments, nor even done according to the judgments of the nations that are all around you. So again, they failed in following God's law and God's way. And this is why judgment is being brought upon the modern nations of Israel in the end time. And then continuing in verse 12, it shows then what this interpretation is to be, and some of it is evident, but nonetheless it says 1/3 of you shall die of the pestilence, of the pestilence, meaning being consumed with famine in your midst, and 1/3 shall die with the sword all around you, and I will scatter another 1/3 to all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. So now this is what's going to be happening to the physical nations of Israel in the end time. And of course, that's not talking about Israel, which is the modern nation of Judah, just one of the 12 tribes, but all the lost 10 tribes, as well as Judah can be included in that as well. Then back up to verse 3 and 4. Here's the interesting part of this prophecy. It says, you shall also take a small number of them, speaking of the hairs that he had weighed out, a small number, and bind them in the edge of your garment. Then take some of them again and throw them into the midst of the fire and burn them in the fire. From there, a fire will go out into all the house of Israel. So what we see is that there is a special little set apart group, and I believe these to be The spiritual Israelites, again, never meant to be a big people. They're a small flock of people compared to the great numbers of multitudes of people in the world and all the nations. But he says, take these and bind them in the hem. All right. And again, we'll try to relate that to some other things a little bit later. But he also says, okay, I want you to take a other little small amount and throw them into the fire. So he's giving us some insight as to what's going to happen in the future to the people of God. Now notice about the ones that were thrown into the fire, how this correlates with Revelation 3 and verse 18. Revelation 3 and verse 18 shows that some of these people who are quote unquote true Christians in the end time will still have to go through the fire, as it talks about. He took a little bit of them and he threw them, this little amount, into the fire as well. Revelation 3 and verse 18, we see what is required of the Laodicean church of Revelation, the last of this era, of these different eras of God's church throughout the history of time. Revelation 3:18 says, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, white garments that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. So he goes on to talk about their problems, which I'm not going to get into specifically at this time. But what we see is that it says, I counsel you to buy of me gold refined in the fire. Again, analogy of the character that they are supposed to be and should have been developing, but they did not. And God's saying, okay, this time, okay, that we've been talking about here, this end time, you are going to then have to go through that fire with the rest of physical Israel. Now, there was an option there, though, he says, okay, in Ezekiel 5, where there were those that were going to be bound in the hem. He says, but you didn't qualify for that. So you are going to have to go through this fire as well, this fire then that the rest of physical Israel was going through that we had talked about in Ezekiel 5. Now, the others, though, are going to have this place of safety. This is a term that, okay, it's not found in the Bible, but it's common within certain churches and church groups. It's called a place of safety, where God will keep his faithful people away and out of harm's way in the future. Now, we're going to address some different concepts here, and there's some different ideas about the place of safety, or whether there is even a place of safety, and whether we're going to be protected somewhere away from here, or we're just going to be protected where we are. Okay, so let's just address that first off. God can protect us where we are, right? We just went over the 144,000 of Revelation 7. Okay, we're talking about how they went through the Great Tribulation, right? But then they did not have to go through the day of the Lord. Right? So again, we've spoken about that, and I won't go into what that exactly means and how that all plays out. But what we see, though, is that they are then protected where they are, this 144,000. So if God can do that for them, then he can do that for us. He could do that if that is what he wanted to do, if that was his plan. And the Bible is littered with other examples of how God protected people where they were. Like, for instance, Daniel. Daniel was a captive in Babylon. He was thrown into the lion's den. God protected him. He didn't take him out of Babylon. He didn't even take him out of the lion's den, but he protected him where he was. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his buddies, his friends at the time, they were thrown into the fire. God protected them in the fire. Rahab, she was, from the wall of Jericho. And so everybody was, killed in Jericho, but she was saved out of it where she was. So what we see then, again, is all things are possible with God. We don't doubt that. And he could do this if that was what he wanted to do. But as we will go through today and show, it doesn't appear that that is what he is going to do. And it's not the way that he is going to work with these people that he is going to save out of the Great Tribulation and the day of the Lord. Now, let's turn over to Zephaniah 2. Zephaniah 2, verses 1 through 3. Zephaniah 2, verses 1 through 3. Now, interestingly, or again, it shouldn't come as a surprise, I should say, but still, nonetheless, it's great and cool and by design the way these things work out. But Zephaniah means hidden of Jehovah or Yahweh. It means God has hidden, or God has concealed, or God has secreted. Right? And that's what the name Zephaniah means. It means God has hidden. Now, this is part of the message. Now, the context of Zephaniah, the whole book of Zephaniah, is the day of the Lord, the seventh seal, this bad time that we're talking about, when God brings his retribution on mankind for their sins and what they're doing, and even specifically what they're doing to his people. And the book of Zephaniah mentions the phrase day of the Lord. Believe it or not, 3 short chapters. It mentions it more than any other book in the Bible. It mentions it a total of 7 times, I think I searched and found out. 7 times. Okay, and we're going to read 2 of those times in Zephaniah 2, verses 1 through 3. So we see what the context is that this is talking about the day of the Lord, which is yet in the future. Zephaniah 2 and verse 1. It says, "Gather yourselves together, yes, gather together, O undesirable nation. Before the decree is issued, or the day passes like chaff, before the Lord's fierce anger comes upon you, before the day of Lord's anger comes upon you, seek the Lord." So before this happens, okay, and he's talking about, oh, undesirable nation. Again, a reference, again, you wouldn't think that we're going to be called that, but that's the way that the world views the church, God's people, his holy nation. In fact, that's what 1 Peter 2, verse 9, I think it is, talks about, is that, we are a holy nation. So we are viewed as a nation. And of course, it shouldn't come as any surprise to us that we're undesirable in terms of the way the world has viewed us. I mean, it viewed Christ that way, so of course it's going to view us. It did these things to Christ, it's going to do these things to us. So there's a correlation there that we can see for sure. But he's saying, before the decree is issued, okay, he's saying, okay, before this day of the Lord comes, and it's coming, and it may come upon you, but he says in verse 3, here's what you need to do. And notice who he's talking about as well. "Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteous, seek humility." Okay, so who is he talking about? Okay, who is this way? Right? He's talking about the true Christians, the ones who live a godly life of justice, righteousness, and humility and meekness. Okay, there are no others that live that type of life except for God's people, okay, who have his spirit and who are living that way. And then he goes, "It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger." Okay, so here we have this connotation, this first example that we've come to, that God is saying that, okay, before the day of the Lord comes, there is this opportunity for those who are acting a specific way to be hidden, okay, in the day of God's anger. They do not have to go through the ramifications of what is going to be happening at that time. Now, let's turn over to Psalm 31, verses 19 and 20. And we're not by any means going to go through all the scriptures that talk about these types of things and make references to them, but we're hopefully the most salient ones we'll be able to cover today and try to piece this together and to show that God indeed is going to provide a place of safety, a place where he can hide us, a place of refuge that we may reside during this time. Psalm 31, verses 19 and 20. Psalm 31, verses 19 and 20. And it's interesting, Psalms has become even more and more interesting the more you look into it and the more you understand that David had God's Spirit and that God revealed things to David as well as other men in that time, and the prophetic nature of a lot of the stuff that he wrote, even in the Psalms. But he goes, "Oh, how great is your goodness, which you have laid up for those who fear you," God's people, "which you have prepared for those who trust in you in the presence of the sons of men. You shall hide them in the secret place." The secret place of your presence from the plots of man. So whatever it is that man's plotting and planning and doing at that time, we're going to be hidden from them. "You shall keep them secretly in a pavilion from the strife of tongues." Now, interestingly enough, that word for pavilion is sukkah. In other words, booths, like we have in terms of the Feast of Booths. In fact, let's turn back over to Leviticus 23, verses 42 and 43. Just make a little correlation here between what God is doing and has been doing, not only in the past, but will do again in the future. So we see that God says, okay, I'm going to keep you in a secret place, a secret pavilion. So by implication, it's not going to be necessarily this grandiose place. And he's going to say, yeah, I'm going to secret you away, as it were, into this little booth or hut. In Leviticus 23, verse 42 and 43, where we're given the feast days of God, the ones that we're supposed to be keeping throughout the year, it says in the feast, which is called the Feast of Booths, or this word for pavilion, it says, "You shall dwell in booths for 7 days," the sukkahs, "and all who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So God's saying, okay, here's what I want you to get and glean from this. Here's what I want you to understand is that when I brought you out of this world of sin that Egypt represented, okay, I brought you out and I gave you refuge. Okay, and I want this to be symbolized, and one of the meanings of it is that, okay, there is refuge in me, and it's designated by this Feast of Booths, these sukkahs that they were told to dwell in, so that they would remember and focus on the fact that God brought them out, it was God, and that he protected them. So what we see then is this booth has this symbol of protection by God. So whenever we talk about this in terms of Psalms 31 and verses 19 and 20, again, you hide them in a secret place and you secretly put them in a sukkah. And again, the connotation is that it's God protecting man from when he took them out of this sinful place and brought them to where he wanted them to be, to keep them away from the things that were going on. Let's turn over to Isaiah 10 and verse 5. We'll look at a few scriptures here in Isaiah. Isaiah, let's begin in verse 5 of chapter 10 to begin with. Isaiah 10 and verse 5. "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hand is my indignation." Again, God talks about this day of the Lord in terms of being his time of indignation, as the word is translated from the Hebrew. Skip down to verse 24 and 25. And of course, let me just give his background. We know that Assyria is going to be the rod of God's anger here that it talks about. In the future, he's going to be, Assyria, modern day Germany, is going to be the one that provides this correction on the physical nations of Israel at that time. Of course, they go too far and they do too much, but nonetheless, it is because God is indignant with the people of Israel that he sends Assyria as his rod, this implementation of punishment upon them. Now, going down to verse 24, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrian." So this king of the north is going to come down at the end time, okay, and he's going to be this beast power. "He shall strike you with a rod and lift up his staff against you in the manner of Egypt, For yet a very little while, and the indignation will cease, as will my anger in their destruction. So, okay, we're just putting this all in terms of what's going to happen and what God's calling this in time. Now, go over to chapter 26, verses 20 and 21. And notice what happens in further during this time of indignation. Isaiah 26, verses 20 and 21. So again, he tells them in Isaiah 10, verse 24, not to be afraid of the Syrian. And he further goes on in chapter 26 and verse 20 and reinforces that. He says, come, my people, enter your chambers. Okay, again, this relationship to a small place of protection. Okay, you had the booth, the sukkah. Now we have a chamber here, or this kind of apartment. And shut your doors behind you, hide yourself, as it were, for a little moment, until the indignation is past. So once again, we have God saying, okay, I'm bringing this indignation, this day of indignation upon the world. Assyria is going to be the rod of my anger. They're going to come down, but don't worry about Assyria and what they're going to do, because I am going to allow you, okay, I'm going to bring you, I'm going to put you into these chambers, these booths, and I'm going to shut the doors behind you for a little moment. Okay, a reference to a short period of time, kind of like what we're talking about in terms of the hour of trial that's coming upon the world, this short period of time, relatively speaking. And they're left there until the indignation is past. Okay, this term for the day of the Lord. For behold, the Lord comes out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth will disclose her blood and will no more cover her slain. So we see then that, okay, they're going to be protected from this great and terrible day of the Lord when God metes out his retribution upon the world for their sins, and it's a punishment. And again, he doesn't do this for no reason. He does it to bring about repentance. He does it so that they have this example and so that they understand what it is that their ways lead to. And he's going to, again, give them another opportunity in the future. So we don't look at this as being a harsh God, but just being a parent that does have to give the discipline in its due time. And you notice, too, that he says that during this time, it's to punish the inhabitants of the earth. So he says, okay, I'm going to put you away. I'm going to secret you away into this place of safety. Okay, while these things are going on earth. And this is a point I think that we need to make. Let's turn over to Revelation 12 and verse 14. And the fact is that this place of safety will be on earth. It's not going to be in heaven. All right. There's, in fact, I think we need to understand too, and I'm not going to go into it, because of lack of time, and we have too much information even for today. But we don't go to heaven. We don't go to heaven when we die. In fact, when we are raised up with Christ at his return, okay, we meet him in the air. We don't go up to the third heaven where he is. He comes down. He meets us in the air. It's not that we even ever go to heaven. So we're definitely not going to go whenever it's time for this place of safety during the Great Tribulation and the Day of the Lord, much less even after that. So what we're looking at is that this place of safety is definitely on earth. And I think we see this even more clearly here in Revelation 12 and verse 14 than we did even in the previous verse. Revelation 12 and verse 14. But the woman, speaking of the church, was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she may fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So, okay, we have the woman. She is brought into this place by what we will see as supernatural means. And she is nourished there for a time, which is a year, times 2 years and a half a time, half a year. So 3.5 years altogether, which is where we get the length of time for the Great Tribulation. Is the Great Tribulation and the Day of the Lord comprise this 3.5 years that she is nourished and kept on earth away from the day of the Lord and the events that are going on around her. Psalm 17, verse 8. Keep your finger here in Revelation 12, if you would. In fact, I can just read these. These are single verses. Psalm 17, 8 says, "Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me under the shadow of your wings." So again, he's saying, keep me in the hem of your skirt. Hide me under your wings, the wings of this great eagle that is going to transport in some fashion God's people to a place of safety. Exodus 19 and 4. Verse 4 is going to put your notes into no. It says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Again, he talks about bringing them, again, this is what we're talking about in Leviticus 23 before, is that he brought them out of Egypt. And the reference to the way that they came out of Egypt, and I think we can make a parallel in terms of how it's going to be in the future, that it's going to be by God, that the protection comes from him. But he says, Exodus 19:4, "I bore you on eagle's wings." So when he brought them out of Egypt to their quote-unquote place of safety, it was on eagle's wings. And so we see this symbolism that is pervasive in the way that God protects in the past, as well as the way he's going to protect in the future, and that this was all done on earth as well. So back to Revelation 12, verse 15. "So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman." That's Satan. And we can surmise that this water is, a flood of an army, it seems, that's going to go after the woman, like the army did when it left Pharaoh. And it's going to go after the church as it's fleeing to a place of safety, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. So again, trying to, whether it's a literal flood or water or whatever kind of natural disaster, because Satan has that power to be able to, manipulate the weather, as we saw in Job. And it's, all within the realm of what God allows. Or whether he's motivating through the attitudes or wrong attitudes, the powers of that time to go after the church. Whatever it is, they're trying to kill this people that God is promising safety to. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. So what we see then is that it was the earth, where the woman was, on earth, not heaven, that opened up, similar, the imagery to me is the one that's evoked by the story of Korah, where the 250 of them, they stood up against Moses and the earth opened up, swallowed them up. But nonetheless, whether it's in the fashion that the Red Sea opened and swallowed them up, the army that pursued God's people, his nation of Israel, the physical people at that time. Nonetheless, the main point here is that it was the earth that helped the woman. The earth opened its mouth, and it was where the woman was, in the earth, being borne on the wings of eagles towards a place of safety. And then the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So what we see is that there are other church members that do not make it to the place of safety. They have the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. And he turns his attention back to them. These are the ones, that little other piece of hair or hairs that Ezekiel had that he threw into the fire. Now, we'll get back to a little bit of that later. So what we see then, it's not in heaven, but it's on earth. Now, the question then remains, as I think we're very curious about, is where on earth would this be? We'd all love to know this. Okay, now, whether we can actually know it without a shadow of a doubt, I don't think so. But if the Bible does give any indication or a hint, then we may see it in the following verses. Isaiah 16, verses 1 through 4. Isaiah 16, verses 1 through 4. Isaiah 16 and verse 1. Send the lamb to the ruler of the land. So it's supposed to be a sort of tribute. From Selah to the wilderness. Now the word here for Selah is rock or crag. Okay, so sometimes when you're translating, you have to go, okay, do I say the name of the city, or is it talking about what the city means? So, for instance, Baton Rouge means red stick. All right, the red sticks were set up as perimeters on properties, and that's how people knew where their property ended and began. And so they said, okay, Baton Rouge, red stick. But okay, so it says from the red stick or from the rock. Okay, or do you mean the actual city, Baton Rouge, or do you mean the red sticks are the part of the property? Well, again, they don't always know, but this is where we're going to try to get to this, and we'll see that they actually translated a different way here in another verse. So it says, from Selah to the wilderness, to the mount of the daughter of Zion, for it shall be a wandering bird thrown out of the nest, so shall be the daughters of Moab at the fords of Arnon. Verse 3, take counsel, execute judgment, make your shadow like the night in the middle of the day, hide the outcasts. Do not betray him who escapes. Let my outcasts dwell with you, O Moab. Be a shelter to them from the face of the spoiler, for the extortioner is at an end, devastation ceases, the oppressors are consumed out of the land. So again, what we have then, okay, and we're going to put some words together here, but we have this rock area, and it says, hide my outcast, hide my undesirable nation, as it were. Do not betray him who escapes. So these people are escaping, leaving, as they were told, the things that they were to leave behind and move forward in much the same way that the Israelites had to leave behind and leave a lot behind. I think in the future, we're going to see that this is also the case. That, okay, when it becomes time to go, it's time to go and you leave. And you have to escape what is going on around and what is especially about to come. Now, let's go over to chapter 42, verses 10 and 11. Isaiah 42, 10 and 11. Isaiah 42, verse 10. Sing to the Lord a new song. All right. What does that evoke? I mean, again, we go through the Bible, you start going through the Bible enough, you start seeing these things, and you're going, okay, or come across a new song, that rings a bell. Well, it just so happens that it was it last week before, when we were doing the message on the 144,000, that in Revelation 14:3 is that they sang, as it were, a new song, which again references back to Revelation 5. And it was the 144,000 that were singing this new song. It was these people of God. And that's the main point that I want to make. It says, okay, so who is it that would be singing a new song here? And again, this is a prophetic chapter here, especially the beginning up to this point. It says, sing to the Lord a new song. This is who he's talking to. And his praise from the ends of the earth, and you who go down to the sea and all that is in it, you coastlands and you inhabitants of them. Let the wilderness and its cities lift up their voice, the villages that Kedar inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing. Let them shout from the top of the mountains. So what we're seeing here, again, is this word Selah. And interestingly enough, in the King James Version, it says, let the inhabitants of the rock sing. Okay, so they saw fit now in this time to say, okay, it's not necessarily, as far as they can tell, referring to a place, but it's referring to an area in terms of a rock. All right, so again, whether it is or it isn't, and whether God is hiding certain things from the prying eye or not, we'll see as we continue to go along. But it says, let the inhabitants of the rock sing. So who is it that is singing here from the rock? Okay, we've established then this one singing this new song. It's these 144,000. It's part of them anyway. It is those who are at the rock, this place that is also called Selah at other places. They are the ones that are singing, and this is where they are at this time. And so if we start looking and putting together Isaiah 16, which we just read, talking about the outcasts are in Moab, which is, again, modern day Jordan, and you start looking at these rocks, you're going, okay, well, perhaps we're starting to get a picture of where it is that God may save us out of this trouble. Now, here's what some have said in the past, is that there's a place called Petra that many of us know about that is in modern day Moab, which is Jordan. And we look at this place, okay, and right now it's a tourism attraction. It was used to be a home to the Bedouins, and I think the Bedouins are still there and hang out in that area. But Petra, even the word itself, also means rock. And so all of a sudden you're starting to make these type of associations that, okay, this could be the rock. And it has these ready-made caves in it, these little rooms, these little chambers, these little, again, you could call them sukkahs into a certain degree. And they start looking at other things. And here's the part that kind of disturbs me about that, is that they say, okay, well, look, it's got these narrow entrances, these shafts, as they call them, that are easily protected. You can fortify yourself because everybody has to funnel in this, and it doesn't take as much to handle these armies that may come and attack you. And so the whole area is somewhat of a fortification. Well, okay, the problem I have with that is, okay, number one, in terms of today's armies, that means hardly anything. If you want to just drop a bomb on it, you drop a bomb on it and obliterate the whole thing. Not only that, modern day armies don't have to go through this little narrow entrance, which I think comes down to about 10 or 12 feet wide. They just go right over. That's not an issue today. But the main issue too is that you're going, okay, well, this would be a good place to be a fort and for us to be protected because of the physical nature of it. I'm going, no, that's not the way it works. It's God that's going to be the one that protects us. And the only way that we can be protected is by God, especially, as I said before, in terms of today's modern warfare. And as far as I'm concerned, the scripture that says, pray that your flight, whenever you flee to the place of safety, that it not be on the Sabbath, that it not be on the winter. I would add that it not be at Petra, okay? And of course, I say that tongue in cheek. But Petra is not going to be the most comfortable place. But of course, if it is the place, then you're going to say, okay, well, this is better than the alternative. And God says he's going to provide us with our bread and water and what we need. And so again, no matter where it is, we should be thankful to be there and not anywhere else. So one final scripture, Psalm 27, verse 5 on this subject in terms of where it might possibly be. I want to add this extra scripture here to show that why it might not actually even be Petra. And even this term, Selah, this crags are typically, is my understanding, are at the top of the ridge of a mountain. You don't normally have crags at the bottom. Even if it's low, the crags can be low, but there's nothing really above them. But, that's not to say that you can't have crags someplace else. But Psalm 27, verse 5, Psalm 27, verse 5. For in the time of trouble, he shall hide me. Okay? Are we starting to see now what the trouble is that's being talked about? Okay? He shall hide me in a place of safety. In his pavilion. Okay? Again, words similar to sukkah. Still means hut, same type of thing. In the secret place of his tabernacle. So it's hidden and it's also secret. He shall hide me. All right, so all the things that we've been talking about kind of summed up here in this one verse. And then he says, he shall set me high upon a rock. All right, so now to me, it's like, okay, what are we talking about? It's high upon a rock. In Petra, you're kind of down low. Sometimes the caves are down there, but the other scriptures talk about that you're going to be able to see certain things going on around, whether that's figuratively or just the fact what's happening because of Bible verses or not. We still see here it says high upon a rock. And so to me, that kind of, in that sense, rules out Petra. And of course, it's been my experience, and I'm speaking anecdotally, that whenever we all think it's something, it's usually not right. It can be something else. And so, again, I'm not going to be stuck on where it is, and I can't, even if I do know it is where it is, even if I know it's Petra, the times are going to be such that you're not going to get there on your own, and nor am I. Now, there is, though, okay, what we have to understand, why it is that we're not going to be able to get there, okay, is because there's a criteria for getting into the place of safety. Let's turn over to Luke 21, verses 34 through 36. Luke 21, verses 34 through 36. Again, this is the end time prophecy. It's one of the longest ones. Again, it's synonymous to the one in Matthew 24, or parallel, I should say, which is indeed the longest one, the Olivet prophecy of Christ that he gave. Luke 21, verse 34, it says, "But take heed to yourselves," and this is Christ speaking, "lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, that day come on you unexpectedly." He says, okay, you careful, this stuff's coming. It's for sure coming. And it's on that day, the day of the Lord, is coming. All right? Don't be caught up in everything going around you, for it's going to come as a snare on all those who dwell on the face of the earth, everyone. And here's this admonition, verse 36. "Watch therefore and pray always." You got to stay awake. You got to be on top of these things, and you have to be praying about it, "that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man." So he's going to say that there's this point where God's going to say, okay, are you worthy? Okay, let's do an accounting and see if you are. What is it then, is this criteria? And the main one, I think we find back in Revelation 12 and verse 11. Let's go back there just briefly, if you want, or I can read it for you. It's just the single verse. It's in the context, remember, of the woman escaping, right? And going off to the place of safety, and the Satan, the dragon, goes after them. But then it says he turns his attention and goes after these others who have God's testimony and his commands. All right. But notice the difference, the subtle difference here in verse 11 of who it is that makes it to the place of safety. In verse 11 of Revelation 12, it says, "And they came and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of the testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death." This is the difference, okay? They too had the commands and the testimony of Christ, right? But they did not love their lives to the death. They were willing to lay down their lives in a spiritual manner before all this came about. And because they did not because they did lay them down in a spiritual manner, they did not have to lay them down in a physical manner. Let's turn over to Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, and see what it is that God asks of us as a Christian. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. Again, we'll try to quickly go over what this means. Again, we could spend quite a bit more time on this. But Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, he says, "I beseech you therefore." So Paul is now talking all the way up until this point, and he's talking about all these things. And he says, now based on what has come before, right? So this is a summation, a conclusion, as it were, to the previous 11 chapters where he was talking about justification, sanctification, salvation, reconciliation. And now he's talking about application. He says, okay, therefore, because of everything that came before, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God. This is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So, as a Christian, we are to put God's law into practice. And this is this ongoing correlation between faith and works that James so succinctly and pricely says, with great price and great value says for us, and really eliminates this idea that you can have faith without works. But he says, okay, faith with works is a necessity. Without it, it's dead. It's a dead faith. So this scripture tells us that in this day and age, that we need to fully comprehend and also implement this fact that we need to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, when he talks about present, now he's talking about it kind of in opposition to what he was talking about it before in Romans 6. In fact, 2 verses for you, Romans 6 verses 13 and 16. And I can just read them for you if you want, or you can go back to them very quickly. But it goes hand in hand, but now we're talking about the opposite aspect. In verse 13 of Romans 6, it says, Do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourself to God as being alive from the dead and instruments of righteousness. Okay, how are we to present ourselves? Well, you don't do it this way, but you do it this way. And this is what we're talking about in Romans 12. And then verse 16, it says, Do you not know then that whoever you present yourselves slaves to, okay, do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves? So if you present yourselves as sin, leading to death, or obedience leading to righteousness. So we're talking about the fact that, okay, how do you present yourself? Well, in a righteous manner. So he's saying that we're not to be unclean and disobedient and lawless, but rather that we're to be righteous, following the example of Christ. And we are to be a sacrifice, like Christ was a sacrifice in that respect. We're to be acceptable to God. We're to be presenting ourselves with spiritual offerings and spiritual sacrifices. And this is what Paul goes on to expound in later in this chapter 12, which we're not going to get into, is that we are to become this living sacrifice. Do you get the difference there? Not one that has to die like the animals in the old sacrificial system, or like Christ did, but that we have to be a living sacrifice. And this is how we present ourselves, like the animals used to be presented, right? Without spot, without blemish. Okay, that's how we are to present ourselves, sinless, righteous. So when we're talking about then bringing it forward to the future, these people that we talked about, the Laodiceans in Revelation 3:18, they were not willing to make the spiritual sacrifices that the Philadelphians were willing to make. And so because those who had this right attitude made these spiritual sacrifices, they were counted worthy to escape the things in the future. But the ones, the other little pinch of hair that did not do this, they were the ones that then had to go and prove by fire, have their character tried, because they didn't do it and present themselves in the right way before. They had to then go through and more than likely perish even in the fire. So this is how crucial it is then to being a living sacrifice, which is our reasonable, this is, again, the word there is logical service that we need to be doing. It's rational that we do this if we believe in God and believe his word. And it's our service to do these things. One last scripture, just in terms of in terms of Galatians 2 verse 20, one that you might know. Again, we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, mostly because they're not our bodies anymore. Christ bought and paid for them. He redeemed them with his blood. And more importantly, we're to be getting rid of ourselves. We're to get rid of that carnal self that we are. Notice what Galatians 2:20 says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So in our Christian walk, we gave up our life a long time ago, the way that we were, and we took on Christ. We have him living in us, and that is what we're trying to be and become, and the way that we're trying to act is like him in that way. We're to draw nearer to God, to put on Christ, to understand his law and to live by it, and we're to apply ourselves, and we're to show ourselves, show what is on the inside of us by acting righteous on the outside. And we're not to be conformed to the world, right? We're to come, John tells us to come out of the world, okay, not to be a part of them. And 2 Corinthians 6 talks about as well. Again, we're this temple of the Holy Spirit that is supposed to be clean. So we don't come back. We don't go back into what we came out of. We're transforming ourselves from what we were into what we are to become. Okay, so he says, be transformed. There's this metamorphosis that takes place by the renewing of our minds. It's this process of change that happens. And a lot of it has to do with the actions, our actions. Okay, this is exactly what the Philadelphians did. The Philadelphians of Revelation 3. In fact, we can turn over there very quickly. Revelation 3. And you can put verses 7 through 12 in your notes. And I just want to hit a few of the highlights. I think most of us are familiar with what it says there in Revelation 3. But notice, okay, this is who we referred to before, that the hour of trial, okay, is during their time, during their era, that is coming upon the world. But they're going to be saved from it. They're going to be saved out of it in this place of safety. Revelation 3, verse 7 says it's to the church of Philadelphia. Verse 8 says they have kept my word. Notice what they do. Notice how they act. Okay, notice why they're counted worthy to escape. They have not denied my name. They stand up for Christ in everything about him, and even in the face of everything that's going on in the world right now. And that is a whole another slew of messages that you could give and how we could be persecuted for the things, the simple things that we believe, even in this time of quote unquote religious freedom. Verse 10, they have kept my command to persevere. Verse 11, they hold fast to what they have and what they've been given, the truth once delivered. And then verse 12, he who overcomes. Again, this implies this action of changing, okay, overcoming the sin that we once were in and that we once committed, all right, and overcoming that through the power of Christ in us and the power of his Holy Spirit, that we then change and we act in a righteous manner. Okay, so we see then that there is indeed a criteria. There is an accounting that is necessary for us to be able to escape what is necessary. So that being said, let me give you two caveats to this situation here. Now, John 21, verses 18 and 19, it's not necessary to go there. I'll just refer to it in passing. Okay, the first one is that not everybody deserves to go to the place of safety, okay? Quote unquote, let me put deserves. None of us deserve salvation in any way, shape, or form. Anyway, but in John 21, 18 and 19, we see that Christ tells Peter, and he says, okay, when you're young, you did this way, and when you're old, it's going to be differently. It's going to be, you're going to be bound. You don't get to go where you wish. And verse 19 says, he spoke this signifying the way that Peter would die and how he would glorify God in his death. So the point being is that if God thinks it's necessary for you to die, okay, so that you can be, quote unquote, on par with what the apostles had to go through, okay, of all people, right, the apostles who were the foundation of the church in the beginning, okay, built upon Christ the center, the cornerstone, the chief, okay, if there's somebody that quote unquote deserves to not go through a martyrdom, it would be them. But they had to go through it because God had a special plan and a very high position for them as well. So they had to emulate Christ even in that respect as well. So if God deems that that's necessary for you, then perhaps you may have to go through the great tribulation as well. Now, the other, and let me just put in just, I think, maybe the corollary to the opposite side of that is that everybody who goes to the place of safety doesn't necessarily deserve to be there. So if you're there, don't rest on your laurels, right? When Rahab, the example that we used before, when she was provided a way of escape out of Jericho, her relatives came with her. it was because of what she did that they came with her. So salvation to them came through her because of what she did. So we see the example that God can work in that way. So how that's manifested, I'm not even going to get into in terms of all the possibilities of the way that could be the case in the place of safety. But nonetheless, that's the first caveat, is that not everyone who deserves to go to the place of safety will be there, and those who are there don't necessarily deserve to be there. So keep that in mind. Now, the second one is this ironic catch that I think we really need to be focusing on. And this is Luke 17, verse 33. And I think it's quite important that we understand this, because I see it as a big problem today, especially in the terms of the subject of the place of safety. Luke 17, verse 33. Luke 17, verse 33. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will preserve it. All right, so here's the irony, right? Is that if that's what you're all about, is saving your own life, okay, then you're not doing the things that you need to be doing, the things that you're supposed to be doing, and you're going to lose your life because of it. Now, it might not be talking in a spiritual fashion, though it is. The ramifications of it are such that if your whole life is set that way, that it's just about yourself, then yes, you will lose your spiritual salvation as well. But whoever loses his life will preserve it, right? This is what we were talking about before. This laying down of your life, presenting it as a living sacrifice now and today. So if we're concerned, if our main concern is about saving, okay, now about the place of safety, is about the fact that we need to figure out all of this, and it's about us, and it's not about anybody else, and it's not about what's important to God, but what's important to us, then yes, there's a very good chance, that you not only will you not be in the place of safety, but that you will have to die during the Great Tribulation. So the question then is, where is our focus when it comes to the subject of this place of safety, or being saved overall? Okay? There's only one, okay, with a capital O, that can save us now or later. There's only one that can save us physically or spiritually, right? In this vein, let's look at Psalm 91. And I think because of lack of time, we'll breeze through it here pretty quickly. We won't spend an awful lot of time on each of the verses, but I suggest that you go through and look at this chapter as a whole and say, okay, how does this apply to me for the future as well as today? Okay, it has applications, I believe, for both, and we'll point that out mostly in terms of what we're talking about today, and that is the place of safety. Psalm 91 and verse 1. Okay, again, how do we apply this to the place of safety? He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. All right, so it's God's, the shadow of his wings that provides us this secret place, because God, verse 2, is my refuge and my fortress. In him will I trust. Not on me, not on my own understanding will I lean, but it's going to be on him that it's all directed towards. Verse 3, it says, from the perilous pestilence. Again, now start thinking about the plagues that are going to come upon mankind. Verse 4, he shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you shall take refuge. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. Again, what did the Israelites do to save themselves? Okay, we're going back to Exodus 19:4, where they came out on the wings of eagles, right? Or, they were born on eagle's wings, as it says. What did they do to save themselves, right? They went through all these plagues that God brought down on the people, but they did one thing. They put the blood on the doorpost, and the other thing was they left in haste. Okay, so if we take two lessons from that, we do the minimal here. Okay, again, it might be a lot for us, but it's a very minimal in terms of the overall plan, in terms of what it means to actually be able to go to the place of safety. And then when it's time to go, it's time to go. And so again, this reference in the future in Revelation 12:14, where it talks about that we're taken on the wings of eagles here, I think we see all of this stuff coming together here in terms of it is God that provides the refuge. It is God that saves whoever he deems he will save, either in a physical or in a spiritual manner. And he is the one where we truly take refuge. Verse 5, so whether there's arrows that fly in the day. Verse 6, there's pestilence in the darkness, destruction in the noonday. 1,000 may fall in verse 7 at your side and 10,000 at your right side. Okay, what's going on? Where are you when all these things happen? Is it when you're escaping and the flood's coming after you? He says, only with your eyes shall you look, and you shall see the reward of the wicked. So again, we're going to see what comes upon those who do not follow God's way. And we're going to see this retribution that God brings on the world during the day of the Lord. In verse 9, the Lord is my refuge, my most high, my dwelling place. So figuratively is that. And then physically, how does he go about saving us? In terms of a place of safety, by providing a physical dwelling place. So no matter where we are or what we're doing or where we're going through, whether now or later, okay, even in the place of safety, we are going to abide in him. We need to understand that, right? He is our dwelling place. He is our refuge. Okay, so even if we're physically saved, it is because of him and it is in him, okay, whether there or now, that this refuge comes. And no evil will befall us, verse 10, nor any plague come near your dwelling, verse 10. So wherever it is that we're dwelling, okay, the plagues aren't going to touch us. And he shall give angels charge over you, verse 11, to keep you in all your ways. And again, there's many references to angels and how they're helping and gathering the elect in Revelation. So if we call upon him, he will answer us in our time of trouble and need, and he will deliver us to his salvation. So one final verse, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. First Corinthians 10, verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful. Okay, there's our emphasis. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with temptation or trial will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. So whether you want to apply that to what you're going through now, or whether it's in the future, whether you are going to the place of safety, or whether you're going to go through the great tribulation, God is faithful to make a way of escape. We have a small part to do, but our salvation, both physical and spiritual, will be up to God. So let's be diligent in doing our part, and we know that God will do his.